March 1945. The air was thick with uncertainty as the truck carrying the German prisoners rolled into the American camp. The women sat in the back, hands clenched tightly on the rough, wooden sides of the truck, their faces covered in dirt and exhaustion. It had been a long journey, one filled with fear and confusion. They had once served the Reich with unwavering loyalty, but now they were captured, defeated, and brought to a place that was both foreign and terrifying. Among the women was Ingrid Brenner, a 23-year-old communications officer. She sat beside Anna Weber, a former nurse, her eyes scanning the camp as the truck slowly came to a halt. The sound of the vehicle's wheels on gravel seemed deafening in the still morning air. Ingrid's heart pounded in her chest, the fear of the unknown threatening to choke her. She had been prepared for the worst when the war ended, but this was a reality she had never considered, the reality of being a prisoner. Anna looked over at her, her blue eyes wide with uncertainty. She had been serving the Reich since 1943, and now she was here, caught in a place where nothing made sense. The world outside had shifted so quickly that it left them all in its wake. The sounds of the camp were overwhelming, soldiers shouting orders, the clanging of metal, and the distant hum of machinery. It felt like a nightmare. The prisoners were ushered off the truck and into the camp. The women walked with their heads held high, but their posture was stiff with the remnants of their former military training. Despite the hopelessness that hung in the air, they refused to show weakness. They were soldiers, after all. Ingrid thought back to the day she had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps. She had believed in the strength of her country, in the cause she had fought for. Now she wasn't sure what she had been fighting for at all. Anna looked over at Ingrid, her lips pressed tightly together. They were led into a small makeshift barracks, their belongings taken from them. They had no choice but to submit to the procedures. A few of the guards watched them silently, their faces unreadable. Ingrid's mind raced, unable to process the enormity of what had just happened. Were they truly defeated? Was the world they had known truly gone? As the women settled into their new surroundings, they glanced at each other, searching for some form of comfort, some small connection in the sea of uncertainty. But none came. They were strangers in a foreign land, captured by the very people they had once been taught to fear. Anna's hand brushed against Ingrid's, and for a moment the connection was all they had. But that moment didn't last long. The guards had already begun their routines, barking orders at the women. It wasn't long before they were shown to their first meal, a plate of corned beef and cabbage. Ingrid stared at the food, confused. This was not the meal of a soldier, not what she had expected. The realization hit her hard. They were not soldiers anymore. They were prisoners, and everything had changed. The women gathered around a long wooden table, their plates of corned beef and cabbage set before them. Ingrid stared at the food, a mixture of disbelief and distaste on her face. She had heard rumors about the Americans' strange food, but she never imagined it would be so unrecognizable. The cabbage was overcooked, limp, and bland. The corned beef greasy and unappetizing. It was nothing like the hearty meals she had been accustomed to back in Germany. "Is this meat?" Anna whispered, her voice a soft tremor in the air. Ingrid glanced over at her friend, seeing the same shock in Anna's eyes. She wasn't sure how to respond. Was this what they were reduced to? A far cry from the dignified meals they had shared during their service. This was a far less refined version of what they had known as sustenance. It was a cruel reminder of their new reality. One by one, the women reluctantly began to eat. The taste was nothing like the meals they had eaten in their homeland, and there was no joy in consuming it. The women, once proud soldiers of the Reich, now felt small and powerless. They had traded their uniforms for rags, their dignity for survival. The idea of food, something so simple, had now become a marker of their defeat. The salty, soggy cabbage lingered in Ingrid's mouth, and she struggled to swallow it. Private James Morrison, an American soldier from Iowa, stood off to the side, watching the women. His eyes were not filled with the hatred that Ingrid had expected. Instead, there was a look of curiosity, perhaps even pity. He shifted uneasily from foot to foot, clearly unsure of how to behave around these women who had once been his enemies. He had heard the stories, the propaganda, but standing here facing them, he couldn't help but see them as human beings, not the faceless enemy he had been taught to despise. He stepped forward cautiously, offering a tray of extra bread to one of the women. She looked up at him in surprise, then glanced down at her plate, unsure whether to accept the gesture. The moment stretched on, and Ingrid could sense the tension in the air. Was this kindness, or was it some sort of trick? Her mind was clouded with confusion, her beliefs fractured. Anna looked at Ingrid, then slowly shook her head. "I can't," she murmured. Ingrid didn't respond. She knew the feeling all too well, but the longer they sat in silence, the more she began to wonder. Could this be the beginning of something different? Could this strange food, this strange gesture, be part of a larger shift, one that would change the course of their captivity? Could it be possible that there was more to the Americans than the hatred they had been taught to believe in? For now, the questions remained unanswered. The meal continued in uneasy silence. The only sounds, the clinking of metal utensils against plates, the soft murmurs of conversation in a language Ingrid barely understood. She stared at the plate in front of her, wishing she could return to a time before the war, before the darkness had clouded everything she had once known. But that world was gone, and this strange new world, was now their reality. The days passed slowly, the monotony of camp life weighing heavily on the women. Ingrid and Anna spent most of their time in the barracks, their interactions with the American soldiers limited to the necessary routines. They were escorted to work, served meals, and given time to rest. But the world beyond their small camp felt like a distant memory. The war was over, but for these women, the emotional battle had only just begun. One afternoon, as Ingrid sat near the barracks, she noticed a young American soldier watching her from across the yard. He was standing near the fence, his posture casual, but his eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her uneasy. His name, she learned later, was Private James Morrison. He was just a boy, not much older than her younger brother, back home in Hamburg. At first, she thought little of it. It was probably nothing more than the idle curiosity of a soldier. After all, these women were their enemies, weren't they? They were the ones who had fought against them. But over the next few days, Ingrid began to see Private Morrison more frequently. He didn't always look at her directly, but she felt his gaze lingering, and it made her uncomfortable. One afternoon, as she helped clean up after a meal, Morrison approached her. He didn't speak at first, just standing a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his uniform. Ingrid could feel the weight of his stare, and she forced herself not to look at him, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Is this what you thought it would be like?" Morrison asked, his voice quiet but not unkind. Ingrid was caught off guard by the question. She had expected harsh words, contempt, maybe even disdain, but instead she found a strange curiosity in his voice. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. "Being a prisoner," he explained. "We're not all what you've been told. You know that, don't you?" Ingrid looked up at him, finally meeting his gaze. For a moment she saw something unexpected, compassion, even empathy in his eyes. It was confusing, and it made her feel uneasy. How could he, a soldier of the enemy, show such understanding? The conversation was brief, and Morrison quickly moved away, leaving Ingrid standing there with more questions than answers. She hadn't expected this strange interaction, this glimpse of humanity. It was nothing like the propaganda they had been taught to believe. The Americans were not just their enemies, they were people too. In the days that followed, Ingrid found herself thinking about Morrison's words. He was right. The things she had been taught to hate, to fear, were not so simple. The men and women in this camp, despite their roles as captors, were also victims of war. And she, despite her uniform, was not so different from them. The world she had known, the world she had fought for, was crumbling around her. It wasn't just the physical destruction of Germany, it was the collapse of everything she had believed in. As she sat alone in the barracks that night, Ingrid realized that she was no longer sure who the enemy was, and that realization made her both afraid and, for the first time in a long while, hopeful. The days grew colder, and the women began to settle into a routine. The shock of their captivity had started to wear off, replaced by a dull, lingering sense of helplessness. The camp had become their world now, and while it was not the world they had imagined, it was their reality. Ingrid and Anna often talked in hushed tones in the evenings, reflecting on their past lives, their families, and the choices they had made. But even these conversations had grown quieter, tinged with the weight of uncertainty. It was during one of these evenings that Ingrid noticed something different. Sergeant Robert Chen, a guard of Chinese descent, had been spending more time near the barracks. Unlike the other soldiers who seemed distant or curt, Sergeant Chen was approachable. He had begun to teach some of the women basic English phrases, using simple gestures and drawings when words failed. Ingrid had learned some English during her school days, but it was rudimentary at best. As she watched Chen's lessons, she felt a strange pull, an urge to understand the language better. Without fully realizing why, she found herself walking toward him one afternoon, her hesitation giving way to curiosity. "Sergeant Chen," she said, her voice uncertain, "may I join the class?" Chen looked up, surprised, but his face softened when he saw her. "Of course," he replied, his English with a slight accent. "I'm glad you're interested. It's a good way to pass the time." The first lesson was simple: greetings, basic phrases like hello and thank you. But it wasn't the words themselves that struck Ingrid. It was the way Chen taught them. He didn't teach from a place of authority or resentment. He taught as though they were equals, sitting side by side, learning together. Ingrid found herself thinking about how strange it was to be treated like this, like a human being, not an enemy. Over the next few days, Ingrid became more involved in the lessons. She found herself learning faster than she had expected. Her vocabulary grew, and so did her understanding of the American soldiers she was interacting with. She started to see them not as faceless figures of hatred, but as individuals with stories of their own. Anna, too, showed interest in the lessons, and soon a small group of German women gathered each day to learn English. The lessons became a source of connection between the two groups, a bridge between the captives and their captors. While the language barrier was still immense, these small moments of exchange allowed the women to see the soldiers as more than just enemies. They began to understand the soldiers' backgrounds, their homes, and their struggles. In return, the soldiers learned about the German women's lives before the war, their families, and the roles they had played in the conflict. But it wasn't just the words that Ingrid found meaningful. It was the shared humanity, the acknowledgement that they were all, in some way, victims of the war. As the lessons continued, Ingrid's thoughts began to shift. For the first time, she wondered if this exchange of language might somehow lead to something greater than mere survival, perhaps to understanding, and even, in time, to healing. The cold winter months seemed endless. The snow fell in thick, heavy layers, covering the camp in a blanket of white. The air was sharp and bitter, cutting through the thin barracks walls, leaving the women huddled together for warmth. There was little to do but wait, and the waiting felt like a slow, suffocating march toward an unknown future. Ingrid spent much of her time in the barracks, now more familiar with the routine of daily life as a prisoner. The work duties were simple: cleaning, sorting, helping with minor tasks, but they occupied her mind and kept her from overthinking. Anna, too, had settled into a quiet rhythm, although she often looked out the window, her thoughts lost in the endless expanse of snow outside. They both longed for something to break the monotony, something to remind them of the world they had once known. One afternoon, Ingrid was sitting in the small, makeshift library, leafing through old books that had been left behind by the previous occupants. She had always loved reading, and despite the strange, almost suffocating silence of the camp, there was a comfort in the words on the page. It was during one of these quiet moments that she noticed Captain Margaret Sullivan walking past the open door. The captain stopped briefly, her eyes meeting Ingrid's. "May I come in?" Sullivan asked, her voice soft but firm. Ingrid nodded, setting the book aside. Captain Sullivan entered the room and sat down across from her. The air between them was thick with the weight of their roles, one the captor, the other the prisoner. Yet Ingrid had come to respect the captain. She had never shown them cruelty, and there were moments when Ingrid saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, something beyond mere duty. "Have you been keeping warm?" Sullivan asked, her concern genuine. Ingrid nodded again, though she knew the captain could see through the lie. The barracks were cold, and the thin blankets they had been given offered little protection against the biting cold. But she didn't want to complain, not to an American officer who had her own burdens to bear. "We're managing," Ingrid said quietly. Sullivan smiled, though the gesture didn't reach her eyes. She stood up, her expression shifting to one of resolve. "If you need anything, please let me know. We may be on opposite sides, but I don't want you to suffer." For a brief moment, Ingrid was struck by the sincerity in Sullivan's voice. It was nothing like the harsh words she had expected from the Americans. It was a simple gesture, a small act of kindness, but it was enough to shift something in Ingrid. As Sullivan left the room, Ingrid sat in silence, her thoughts swirling. She had been taught to fear the Americans, to see them as the enemy. Yet here was Captain Sullivan, offering a kindness that Ingrid had not expected. The realization hit her like a wave. In this new world, things were not as simple as they had seemed before. The enemy was not so clearly defined anymore. The holiday season arrived quietly at the camp. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the ground in white, while the wind howled through the barracks. For the German women, Christmas had always been a time of warmth, family, and traditions. But this year, those traditions seemed like a distant memory. They were far from home, far from their families, and trapped in a world that felt increasingly foreign. Captain Sullivan, aware of the emotional toll the women were enduring, decided to offer them a small respite. She organized a Christmas celebration, allowing the women to decorate the barracks with what little they had: a few scraps of cloth, some bits of string, and makeshift ornaments. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a gesture, a way to acknowledge the holiday, to bring some light into the darkness of their captivity. Ingrid had mixed feelings about the celebration. On one hand, she couldn't help but feel a sense of nostalgia for the Christmases she had once known. Family gatherings, the familiar smell of roasted meats, the soft glow of candles in the window. But on the other hand, this Christmas felt like an intrusion on the grief and uncertainty that hung over them all. Still, she couldn't bring herself to refuse the invitation. There was something about the idea of creating a small piece of home in this strange place that she couldn't ignore. The night of the celebration, the women gathered in the makeshift hall, a room that had been transformed with decorations. Ingrid and Anna stood together, their eyes scanning the other women in the room. There was a sense of quiet reluctance in the air, but also a shared understanding that they had to try, even if just for a moment, to feel human again. Captain Sullivan stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding yet kind. She looked at the women, her eyes soft with understanding. "Tonight we'll share something together," she said. "A piece of home, however small it may be. We'll sing some songs, share some food, and for a little while, forget where we are." The women hesitated at first, unsure of what to expect. Ingrid felt a lump form in her throat as the room grew silent. Then Ingrid spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. "We would like to sing a German Christmas song for you," she said, her accent thick but clear. The women stood together, a mixture of fear and determination in their eyes. They began to sing O Tannenbaum. their voices hesitant at first but growing in strength as they found their rhythm. It was not perfect, but it was beautiful, and it brought a sense of unity to the room. When they finished, Captain Sullivan smiled, and a few American soldiers applauded, their faces soft with emotion. But the real surprise came when Ingrid, gathering her courage, turned to the Americans. "We also tried to learn an American song," she said. "We'd like to sing 'Silent Night.'" The words came out slowly, their English imperfect, but their intentions were clear. As the German women sang "Silent Night" in halting English, something shifted in the room. The walls between captor and captive began to crumble, if only for a moment. For that brief time they were not enemies, they were simply people, connected through the universal language of music. Ingrid caught Private Morrison's eye, and for the first time since her capture, she saw a look of something soft in his expression, compassion, perhaps even a glimmer of understanding. And in that fleeting moment, she felt something stir within her, the possibility of something more than survival. The days that followed the Christmas celebration were quieter, but something had shifted within the camp. The German women no longer moved through the barracks with the same wariness they once had. They were still prisoners, of course, but now there was an unspoken bond beginning to form, not just between the women themselves, but with the American soldiers who watched over them. Ingrid noticed it most in the small gestures, the fleeting moments of human connection that seemed to occur more frequently than before. It was a warm afternoon in January when Sergeant Chen invited Ingrid and a few others to join him for a more advanced English lesson. He had set up a small group outside where the sun filtered weakly through the bare trees. The snow had begun to melt, leaving muddy patches on the ground. It wasn't much, but it felt like a promise of something better. "Today we'll try something new," Sergeant Chen announced, his voice calm and patient. "Let's try talking about your past, where you're from, what you did before the war." Ingrid hesitated. It was a question many of them had avoided, buried beneath the weight of their new reality. Talking about the past felt like inviting pain, a reminder of everything they had lost. But there was something about the way Sergeant Chen asked the question, something in his steady gaze that made it hard to refuse. Maybe it was the openness in his eyes, the kindness that had slowly begun to emerge in the weeks since they'd arrived at the camp. "I'm from Hamburg," Ingrid said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. "I worked as a communications officer for the Women's Auxiliary Corps. I thought I was serving my country, defending it from the enemy. I didn't know what we were really fighting for." Sergeant Chen nodded, encouraging her to continue. Anna, who had been listening quietly, spoke next. "I was a nurse," she said softly. "I believed we were helping our soldiers, healing them. I thought that was all that mattered." The other women began to share their stories, some of them hesitant, others more willing. The conversation wasn't easy, and there were moments of silence when the weight of their pasts became too much to bear. But there was something cleansing about it, as though the act of speaking the words aloud made the past feel less oppressive, less like a secret. As Ingrid listened to the others, she realized that they had all been taught to believe in the righteousness of their cause. They had been soldiers, fighting for a country that had promised them honor and duty. But now, the harsh realities of war had stripped away that illusion. Ingrid felt the weight of those realizations settling in her chest, but there was also a sense of relief. For the first time, she was speaking the truth, not just to herself, but to the people around her. Later that evening, as Ingrid lay in bed, she thought about the words they had shared. The silence that had once defined their captivity felt different now, more bearable. It was still there, the uncertainty, the fear, but it wasn't the same. Something had shifted. They were no longer just prisoners of war. They were people with stories, with voices, and for the first time in months, Ingrid felt like she had a place in the world. The camp was unusually quiet one morning when Ingrid sat in the library, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the pages of an old tattered book. She had grown accustomed to the silence, the stillness, that seemed to permeate every part of their new life. It was a strange kind of silence, one that felt both suffocating and safe. But on that particular day, the quiet seemed heavier than usual, as though something was about to shift. It was Anna who found the newspaper. She had been helping Ingrid organize some of the books when she spotted a stack of old papers tucked away on a shelf. Curiosity got the better of her, and she brought one of the papers over to Ingrid, her hands trembling slightly. "I found this," Anna said quietly, her voice laced with uncertainty. "I thought you might want to see it." Ingrid took the paper from Anna's hands, her heart beginning to race as she unfolded it. The headline read, "Allied Forces Liberate Concentration Camps, Horrors Unveiled." Ingrid's eyes flicked to the images below, the grainy black and white photos showing emaciated bodies, the skeletal figures of men and women who had endured unimaginable suffering. The images were haunting, their faces marked by a mixture of fear, despair, and loss. Ingrid's breath caught in her throat. The words under the photos described the atrocities discovered in the camps, the systematic murder of millions of innocent people. Her hands shook as she read the details, each sentence like a punch to her gut. She could hardly comprehend what she was reading, the horror of it all overwhelming her. Anna was standing beside her now, tears streaming down her face as she gazed at the paper. "Is this real?" she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Did our country really do this?" Ingrid didn't answer right away. She couldn't. She was still trying to process what she was reading, still trying to reconcile this new reality with everything she had believed in. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps to serve her country, to be a part of something she thought was just. But this was a betrayal of everything she had been taught. "I don't know," Ingrid whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know what to believe anymore." The room fell silent as they both stared at the paper, the weight of the revelation settling over them like a dark cloud. The truth had always been buried, hidden beneath layers of propaganda and national pride, but now it was impossible to ignore. As the days passed, the camp became a place of quiet reflection. The women spoke less, their once stiff conversations now filled with uncertainty and doubt. Ingrid found herself thinking about what she had read, about the women in the camp, about what it meant to be part of something that had caused such destruction. For the first time since her capture, Ingrid felt as though she had lost her sense of self. What had she been fighting for? What had she believed in? And could she ever go back to the person she had been before? The revelation from the newspaper gnawed at Ingrid every day. She couldn't escape the images, the faces of the men and women who had suffered in the concentration camps, the haunting stories of horror she had read. The more she thought about it, the more impossible it became to reconcile the image of the Germany she had once loved with the atrocities she was learning about. The country she had served, the ideals she had been raised with, felt like they had crumbled into dust. As the days passed, the emotional weight of it all began to manifest in strange ways. Ingrid had trouble sleeping, her dreams filled with images of war, of death, and of the faces she had seen in the photographs. When she wasn't consumed by memories, she was left with a constant aching emptiness. There was no escaping it. The truth was like a shadow that hung over her, following her wherever she went. The arrival of new orders brought no relief. The camp's atmosphere shifted as the news of the impending repatriation began to spread. Ingrid wasn't the only one who felt conflicted. Many of the women shared the same sense of dread and disbelief. There was no certainty about what they would return to. The letters they had received from home were few and far between, and most had brought bad news. Families lost, homes destroyed, futures uncertain. What would they be going back to? Was there even a place for them in a ruined, broken Germany? The men who had once been their enemies were now their liberators. The soldiers who had guarded them, who had once seemed so distant, were now offering them freedom. But it wasn't the freedom they had expected. It was a bitter, complicated gift. Ingrid found herself talking to Anna more than usual. They had always been close, but now their conversations carried a weight, that hadn't been there before. The talk wasn't about the war or about the camp. It was about what they would return to and whether it was worth going back to at all. Ingrid couldn't deny the pain she felt when thinking about her family, about the people she had left behind, but she also couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense that Germany, the country they had fought for, was gone. The ideals of honor, of defending one's homeland, seemed hollow now. "What do we do now?" Anna asked one evening, her voice raw with uncertainty. "What kind of future can we have there?" Ingrid didn't have an answer. She wanted to believe that there was hope, that they could rebuild and move on. But how could they? How could they go back to a place that had caused so much suffering, a place that might not even want them back? The women's anxiety continued to grow. The return to Germany, once a promise of freedom, now felt like a return to shame. The cold February air blew through the camp, carrying with it the bitter promise of change. The final orders had arrived, and the time to leave was drawing near. The women were being repatriated to Germany, as per the regulations of the Geneva Convention. It was a moment that should have been filled with relief, the end of their captivity, the return to their homeland. But instead, the camp felt more like a prison than ever before. Ingrid sat with Anna in the corner of the barracks, their voices barely above whispers. They had spoken of little else for days, grappling with a question that had come to dominate their every thought. What is home? For months they had lived in this camp, a strange limbo where their lives had been stripped away and they had been forced to confront everything they had once believed. They had been prisoners of war, yes, but they had also been women, soldiers and daughters, each carrying with them the weight of their pasts. And now the prospect of returning to the rubble of Germany, to a country that seemed unrecognizable, was a burden too heavy to bear. "I don't know if I can go back," Anna confessed, her voice shaking. "What if there's nothing left? What if everyone is gone? What if the country we knew is just gone?" Ingrid looked at her friend, her own heart heavy with the same doubts. What would they return to? There were no letters, no word from their families. Ingrid had heard nothing from her parents, no updates, no signs of life. The silence was deafening. How could they go back to a country that had fallen apart, a country that had caused so much destruction? She wondered if Germany, the land she had once been so proud of, even existed anymore. "I don't know," Ingrid whispered, her voice cracking. "I've been asking myself the same thing." Home. What did it mean anymore? For so long they had been trained to believe in the ideals of their homeland. They had fought for it, bled for it. But now, faced with the reality of the war's aftermath, those ideals seemed like lies. The country they had defended had torn itself apart, and the people they had once considered their brothers and sisters were now the very victims of that destruction. The more Ingrid thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't go back to the Germany she had known. The thought of returning to a shattered homeland, where there was no certainty and no hope, felt like a death sentence. But she also couldn't stay here forever. The camp, though it had given them a strange kind of refuge, was no place to build a future. As the days ticked by, Ingrid found herself facing a new, even more daunting question. Could she still call Germany home, or had home, like everything else, been lost to the war? The morning of their repatriation arrived with a sense of finality that settled heavily over the camp. The cold had intensified, and a layer of frost clung to the ground, making everything feel even more distant, even more detached from the world they had once known. The German women gathered in the barracks, their faces grim, their eyes tired from days of uncertainty and worry. The time had come to leave, to return to Germany. Or so they thought. Ingrid stood near the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she stared out at the camp's perimeter. She had tried to prepare herself for the journey ahead, but the truth was, she wasn't ready. She didn't know how to face the unknown, how to walk back into a world that felt like a ghost of what it had been. Anna, who had been standing next to her, broke the silence. Ingrid, she said, her voice filled with quiet resolve, I can't go back. Not yet. Ingrid turned to look at her, startled by the words. What do you mean? We have no choice. We have to go. Anna shook her head, her expression firm. I've thought about it for days, Ingrid. There's nothing for me in Germany, nothing left. I can't go back to that. Not when I know what I've learned here. I want to stay. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating in Ingrid's chest. Stay? The idea was unthinkable. They were prisoners, after all. They were supposed to be repatriated. There was no option for them to remain in America, but as Ingrid looked at Anna, she realized that the decision wasn't one made lightly. It was a choice born of desperation, of survival. Anna was choosing to stay, to build something new, despite the risks. I don't know, Ingrid whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. What will we do? Where will we go? Anna met her gaze, her blue eyes filled with an unexpected strength. I don't know either, but I can't go back. Not when I know what I know now. The things we've seen, the things we've learned. It changes everything. Ingrid's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She couldn't imagine staying, not without a clear plan, not without a place to go. But as she looked at Anna, at the determination etched into her features, Ingrid realized that maybe, just maybe, staying wasn't such an impossible option after all. They were not just prisoners anymore. They were women, with choices to make, with futures to build. The question was no longer about what they were forced to do, it was about what they chose to do. And for the first time since their capture, Ingrid felt a spark of possibility ignite within her. Maybe we do have a choice, Ingrid said softly, her voice steadying. Maybe it's time we start making our own decisions. Anna nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing her face. Together, they would face whatever came next, uncertain, but ready. The decision to remain in the camp was not an easy one. Ingrid had spent the night turning over the possibility in her mind, each scenario leading her down a path that was both uncertain and dangerous. She couldn't shake the image of the soldiers waiting to transport them back to Germany, the promise of freedom that had been given to all the other prisoners. But for her and Anna, freedom now felt like a sentence to an uncertain death, trapped in a country that had turned against its own people. That morning, as the women were called to assembly, Ingrid's heart raced. The camp buzzed with activity as guards moved through the barracks, gathering the prisoners for what they thought was their final departure. Ingrid, Anna, and a few others who had made the same decision kept their eyes down, pretending to follow the orders, trying not to draw attention to themselves. When the order to line up was given, Ingrid's pulse quickened. The others had already formed neat rows, ready to leave. It felt like the end, a moment she had been dreading. But as the commanding officer came down the line, Ingrid stepped forward. Captain Sullivan, she said, her voice trembling but steady, may I speak with you? Captain Sullivan, who had been walking briskly past the rows of prisoners, stopped and looked at Ingrid with a curious expression. She saw the tension in her eyes, the uncertainty, and for a brief moment, something like understanding flickered in the captain's gaze. Of course, Sullivan said, her voice soft but authoritative. She nodded toward the side of the barracks, signaling Ingrid to follow her. Once they were out of earshot of the others, Ingrid took a deep breath. We don't want to go back, she said, struggling to find the right words. Some of us, we've made the choice to stay. Sullivan raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. Stay? What do you mean? You're prisoners of war. You're supposed to return to Germany. Ingrid swallowed hard, her hands shaking. We can't go back to Germany. Not with what we know now. Not with the things we've learned. We don't have a home there anymore. Sullivan studied Ingrid for a long moment, her eyes searching her face. Ingrid could see the captain's internal struggle, her conflicting sense of duty and humanity. After a few moments of silence, Sullivan sighed. I'll speak with higher authorities, she said, but this is unprecedented. You understand the risks, don't you? Ingrid nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision. We do. But we can't go back, not yet. We need time. Captain Sullivan paused, then gave a small, reluctant nod. I'll see what I can do. As Sullivan walked away, Ingrid felt a sense of dread settle in her chest. She had asked for something that might be impossible, but it was done. She and Anna had made their choice, and now they would have to live with whatever came next. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in months, Ingrid felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The days following their conversation with Captain Sullivan were filled with tension. Ingrid and Anna spent much of their time in the barracks, anxiously waiting for news. The women who had chosen to return to Germany were preparing for their departure, packing whatever belongings they could salvage, while Ingrid and the others who had chosen to remain kept to themselves, their minds racing with fear and uncertainty. Every day felt like a slow march toward the unknown. Ingrid had no idea what would happen if their request was denied, if they were forced to board the trucks bound for Germany. Would they be considered deserters, traitors, or would they be given a chance to stay, despite the strange, unprecedented nature of their request? As the days passed, a sense of division began to creep through the camp. The women who planned to return to Germany remained focused, their resolve unshaken. They had made their peace with the idea of going back, uncertain of what awaited them, but determined to face it with courage. But for those like Ingrid and Anna, the uncertainty was a constant weight on their shoulders. They couldn't shake the thought of returning to a country that no longer felt like home, a land in ruins, a place that had caused so much suffering. Ingrid spent hours contemplating the past, the things she had believed in, the choices she had made. She wondered if she could ever truly return to the Germany she had once known, or if that world had disappeared forever, replaced by something far darker than she had ever imagined. One evening, as the women gathered in the mess hall for their evening meal, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The Germans who were preparing to leave were quieter than usual, their faces set in grim determination. Ingrid could see the hesitation in their eyes too, the same uncertainty that had plagued her for weeks. Anna, who had always been the more outspoken of the two, finally spoke what was on everyone's mind. "I'm not sure we can do this anymore," she said, her voice barely audible. "The women who are going back, they've accepted it. But for us, staying feels like, I don't know, like we're trying to change the rules of the game." Ingrid looked at her friend, seeing the strain in Anna's eyes. She knew exactly what Anna meant. Choosing to stay was not just a defiance of orders, it was a rejection of everything they had once believed in. But it was also a chance to rebuild, to redefine themselves, to take ownership of their futures. "I don't know what the right choice is," Ingrid admitted, "but I know we can't go back, not without losing everything." Anna nodded, her expression a mixture of fear and resolve. "Then we'll stay together. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." Ingrid felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The path ahead was uncertain, but at least she wasn't walking it alone. The tension in the camp seemed to grow with each passing day. The final decision on whether Ingrid, Anna, and the others would be allowed to stay was still pending. As the women prepared for what felt like an inevitable departure, an unexpected visitor arrived at the camp, a German-American priest named Father Heinrich Miller. Captain Sullivan had granted his request to speak with the women, believing that his presence might provide some comfort or clarity. Father Miller's visit was part of an outreach program aimed at offering spiritual guidance to those who had suffered the traumas of war. For the women who had been captured, the visit was a much-needed break from the mounting pressure and fear. Father Miller was a middle-aged man with gentle eyes and a calm demeanor. He greeted the women with a warmth that immediately put them at ease. When he spoke, his voice was soft but firm, carrying the weight of a man who had seen the world's darkness but still believed in the possibility of redemption. For Ingrid, the presence of the priest stirred something deep within her. It had been months since she had allowed herself to think about faith, about the world she had known before the war. The war had stripped so much from her, her certainty, her country, her faith. She had never questioned her beliefs before, but now, sitting in front of this priest, she found herself wondering if she could ever trust in anything again. Father Miller sat with the women in the barracks, speaking in their native German, making it easier for them to open up. He asked them about their experiences, their feelings, their fears. He didn't offer easy answers, nor did he preach. Instead, he asked them difficult questions, questions that made Ingrid think deeply about her past choices. "You say you want to stay," Father Miller said, his voice gentle but probing. "But why? What does it mean to stay in a place that is not your own? What will you find here that you can't find in Germany?" Ingrid felt the weight of his question. She had thought about it countless times, but the answer always seemed just out of reach. What was she really looking for? What did it mean to stay in a country that had once been her enemy? Was she seeking redemption, a second chance? Or was she simply running from the harsh truth of what Germany had become? Father Miller didn't rush them to answer. He simply let the question hang in the air, giving each woman the space to reflect. As the conversation continued, Ingrid found herself grappling with these difficult questions, her sense of self slowly shifting in response. When Father Miller left later that day, Ingrid felt a strange peace. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in months, she felt as though she was beginning to understand the deeper purpose of her journey. The path ahead was still unclear, but perhaps for the first time, it was something she could face with a renewed sense of hope. The days after Father Miller's visit passed in a blur of uncertainty. Ingrid found herself revisiting the questions he had asked over and over again. Why did they want to stay? What was left for them in Germany? What did home even mean anymore? Her mind felt like a storm, each thought colliding with the next, each question leading to more confusion than clarity. Anna, too, seemed restless. She spent much of her time sitting by the window, staring out at the camp, her eyes distant. Ingrid knew that Anna had made her decision long ago. She had chosen to stay, to try to rebuild her life in a place that, despite everything, had shown them more kindness than their own country ever had. Ingrid had admired her courage, but now she was beginning to feel the same pull. That afternoon, as Ingrid and Anna sat in the mess hall, the air heavy with the quiet chatter of the other prisoners, Captain Sullivan entered, holding a stack of papers in her hands. The camp grew still as she approached, her gaze sweeping over the room. Ingrid's heart skipped a beat. The decision had come. Sullivan stopped in front of Ingrid and Anna, her expression unreadable. "I've spoken with higher authorities," she began, her voice steady, "and after much discussion, a decision has been made regarding your request." Ingrid's breath caught in her throat. She exchanged a glance with Anna, who seemed equally tense, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Captain Sullivan looked at them both. "The War Department has agreed to allow those of you who wish to remain in the United States to do so. You will be reclassified as displaced persons and will be given the opportunity to apply for immigration status." For a moment, Ingrid couldn't process the words. Her mind raced, but it felt as if she were hearing them through a fog. She looked at Anna, who had a wide, stunned smile on her face. The relief in Anna's eyes was palpable, but Ingrid's emotions were more complex. The idea of staying in America had always seemed impossible, an unimaginable risk. But now it was a real choice, a chance to make something of their lives, to escape the weight of their past and build something new. "Thank you," Ingrid finally managed to say, her voice a whisper. "Thank you for giving us this chance." Captain Sullivan nodded, her expression softening. "You'll have to prove yourselves here, just as you did in the camp. There's work to be done, but this is your opportunity. What you make of it is up to you." As Sullivan turned to leave, Ingrid's mind began to clear. She looked at Anna, who was already lost in thought, no doubt imagining the future that awaited them. For the first time in a long while, Ingrid felt a glimmer of hope. There was a long road ahead, but it was theirs to walk. The decision had been made. Now they had to make it their own. The news of their approval to stay in the United States spread quickly among the camp's inhabitants. The German women who had chosen to return to Germany were silent, some resigned, others still holding on to the hope that their country might somehow offer them a future. But for Ingrid, Anna, and the others who had chosen to remain, it felt like a breath of fresh air. It wasn't freedom in the way they had once imagined it, but it was something. It was a chance to carve out new lives from the ruins of their pasts. Ingrid spent the following days in a daze, processing everything that had happened. She couldn't stop thinking about the decision, the weight of it, the relief, the uncertainty of what was to come. The idea of living in a foreign country, of building a life from nothing, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. She had no family here, no support system, only the strange and tentative bonds she had formed with the other women in the camp. The first step in their new lives came quickly. Captain Sullivan arranged for the women to be taken to a nearby town where they would be temporarily housed while their applications for displaced person status were processed. Ingrid was assigned to live with the Henderson family, who had visited the camp several times during the past months. Mrs. Henderson, a school teacher with kind eyes, had taken a particular interest in Ingrid. She had seen something in her, a spark of intelligence, a desire to learn, and had offered to take her in. The day Ingrid arrived at the Hendersons' house, she was filled with a strange mixture of anticipation and fear. The house was small but warm, with a white picket fence and flowers blooming in the front yard. Mrs. Henderson greeted her at the door with a warm smile and a gentle handshake. "Welcome, Ingrid," she said, her voice soft and welcoming. "We're so glad to have you here." Ingrid was surprised by the kindness she felt. She had been prepared for resistance, for hostility, but Mrs. Henderson's warmth felt like a balm for her weary soul. As the days passed, Ingrid began to feel a sense of belonging in this small American town. Mrs. Henderson was patient with her as she struggled with the English language, helping her with lessons, and the rest of the family, her husband and 2 children, treated her as part of the household. Still, there were moments when Ingrid struggled with the weight of her past. She missed the familiarity of her own country, the language she had spoken since birth. But in this small house, in this quiet American town, she found something she hadn't expected: hope. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about living. She was no longer a prisoner. She was free, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of a future she could shape for herself. The road ahead was long, but it was a road she was willing to walk. Ingrid had settled into her new life with the Henderson family. But there were still days when the weight of the past pressed down on her like a heavy fog. The memories of her life in Germany, of the war, and of everything she had once believed in seemed to haunt her in quiet moments when she wasn't focused on learning English or adjusting to her new surroundings. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Henderson working on her English lessons, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Mrs. Henderson had been asking Ingrid about her family, about her life before the war. Ingrid had avoided the topic, but tonight, something in Mrs. Henderson's voice made her want to open up, to share the truth. "I don't have a family anymore," Ingrid said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what happened to them. I haven't heard from them since the war started. I don't know if they're alive or dead." Mrs. Henderson's face softened with sympathy, but she didn't push. Ingrid had never fully processed the loss of her family, the uncertainty of their fate. It was a gaping hole in her heart that she had buried deep, too painful to confront. But here, in this quiet American home, it felt different. The words came out, and for the first time, Ingrid allowed herself to grieve, even if just a little. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Henderson said gently, her voice full of understanding. "I can't imagine what that must be like." Ingrid nodded, her throat tight. "I don't know if I can ever go back to Germany," she confessed. "I don't know what kind of country I would be returning to. Everything I thought I knew, it's all shattered." I don't know what to believe anymore." Mrs. Henderson placed a hand on Ingrid's, a gesture of quiet comfort. "It's okay to feel lost, Ingrid. You've been through so much, but you don't have to carry that weight alone." Ingrid felt tears well up in her eyes, tears she had been holding back for so long. She had always believed in the ideals of her country, had thought of herself as a loyal soldier, a defender of her people. But the war had shown her a different side of Germany, one that was filled with lies and betrayal. She had been part of a system that had caused so much pain, and that was a truth she couldn't escape. But in this moment, sitting at the kitchen table with Mrs. Henderson, Ingrid realized something. She didn't have to face this alone. She wasn't the same person who had walked into the camp months ago. She had changed, and with the support of people like Mrs. Henderson, maybe she could find a way forward, a way to rebuild, to heal, and to finally find peace with the past. The journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, Ingrid believed it was possible. Years had passed since Ingrid's arrival in America, and the life she had once thought impossible had slowly unfolded in unexpected ways. The small town that had first seemed so foreign to her had become home. She had learned the language, found work as a translator, and even made a few friends. The Hendersons had become more like family than mere hosts, their kindness and understanding helping her piece together a new identity, one that wasn't defined by war, loss, or guilt. But as much as she had built a life here, Ingrid couldn't forget the past. The journey toward healing was far from linear. There were still moments when the memories of Germany, of the war, of the women she had met in the camp would come rushing back. The faces of the soldiers she had once viewed as enemies now felt like distant companions in her journey, their kindness to her during her captivity leaving a permanent mark on her heart. One day, she received a letter from Anna. It was brief but heartfelt, filled with updates on her life in America. Anna had become a nurse, dedicating her life to helping others. She had even started a small family of her own. Ingrid smiled as she read about Anna's journey, how she had overcome so much, how she had built a new life in this foreign land, just like Ingrid had done. But what struck Ingrid most was the last line of the letter. "We found redemption, Ingrid, not in forgetting, but in choosing to live." Those words lingered in Ingrid's mind for days. Redemption. It wasn't something she had ever imagined for herself, let alone for a country that had caused so much pain. But Anna was right. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing to move forward despite everything that had happened. As Ingrid sat on the porch of her small house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she realized that she had begun to forgive herself. It had taken years, but the constant effort to rebuild, to find purpose in the aftermath of so much loss, had finally allowed her to see that redemption wasn't something that could be granted. It was something that had to be earned piece by piece through action, reflection, and choice. Ingrid's work as a translator had led her to a new role, one that would allow her to bridge the gap between displaced persons and American families. She had become an advocate for other refugees, helping them find their footing in the unfamiliar world of post-war America. Her own experience had made her the perfect guide for those who came after her, just as she had been guided by the kindness of others. As she looked out over the small town she now called home, Ingrid knew that her journey wasn't over. There was still work to be done, still lessons to be learned. But for the first time in years, she felt at peace. She had made the choice to live, not just survive, and that was a victory in itself.